The hall was cold in the way that old houses are cold. Not from any failure of the hearth, but from years of quiet and diminished fires and rooms that had long since learned to keep their own counsel. Dorothea Seville had grown up with that cold. She knew the particular creak of the third stair, the way the drawing-room curtains never quite hung straight on the left side, the faint smell of damp that rose from the east corridor whenever it rained. She knew these things the way one knows the face of someone beloved, not by study, but by accumulated nearness. Thornwall had been in her family for 4 generations. What it was now, diminished and quietly failing, was still more home to her than any warmer, newer place could ever have been. She was upstairs when she heard the carriages. There were 2 of them, which meant her father had not come alone. She had not expected him to, precisely, but she had hoped. He had written that he was bringing a guest, and that she was to prepare the blue room as well as his own, and that she was not to worry herself unduly about the state of the garden. That last instruction had made her set the letter down and look out the window at the garden in question, which was, in truth, a considerable source of worry. She did not go down immediately. She finished what she was doing, mending the tier in one of the dining-room tablecloths, because the linen they had left was not sufficient for a formal table without it. And then she smoothed her skirt and went to the mirror above the washstand and looked at herself grey wool. It was clean and well pressed, and it was the warmest thing she owned, and she had not to change it, and she had not thought to change it. She looked at herself for a moment with the same calm, assessing gaze she gave to everything. The accounts, the roof, the question of whether they could afford to rehire even one of the 3 servants they had let go in the past 2 years, and then she went downstairs. The men were already in the hall. Her father stood near the door, still in his travelling coat, looking tired in the particular way. He always looked tired now, as though something had gone out of him that he could not quite locate. Beside him stood a man Dorothea did not know. He was tall. She noticed at first, because the ceiling in the entrance hall was lower than it had once seemed, or perhaps it was simply that he filled the space differently than the people who usually occupied it. He was dark-haired, perhaps 10 years older than she was, and he was looking at the room with the focused attention of someone cataloguing rather than admiring. His eyes, she would notice later, were not grey. They were the particular dark blue of early evening, and they moved through the hall the way water moves. Observant, unhurried, missing very little. Dorothea. Her father came forward and kissed her cheek. He smelled of the road, and of something else, something tired and faintly apologetic, and she held his arm a moment longer than she might have. Father, she looked at the guest. May I introduce Lord Calder? Her father said. Lord Calder, my daughter, Miss Seville. Lord Calder inclined his head. He did not smile, but there was nothing unfriendly in it, simply the reserve of a man who did not perform warmth he did not feel. She respected that, in spite of herself. Miss Seville, he said. His voice was low and even. My lord. She met his gaze and held it for exactly as long as was polite, and then she turned to her father. I've had Mrs. Peel prepare the blue room. Dinner will be ready at 7. Will you want tea first? Her father said, yes, they would, and she led them toward the sitting room, and she did not look back at the man who stood for a moment longer. In the entrance hall, his eyes still moving through the space, noting, as she had noted so many times before, the places where the paint had begun to fail. She did not know at that moment that he owned the principal mortgage on Thornwall. She did not know that her father had brought him here because the mortgage was 3 months in arrears, and Lord Calder had suggested, had apparently been quite civil about it, that he should like to see the property before making any decisions. She did not know any of this. She found out that evening. Her father waited until after dinner, which she thought was both considerate and cowardly, and when he told her, he did not quite look at her, and she sat very still in the chair across from his and let him finish before she said anything at all. What she said when he had finished was, "How long have you known?" He pressed his eyes shut briefly. "Several months." She thought of the letters she had written him over those months, the cheerful ones, where she had described the progress on the east garden, the practical ones, where she had asked about the roof, the one in January where she had said, quite carefully, that she thought they might need to consider their options, and he had written back to say he was handling it. "I see," she said. "Lord Calder he has not been unreasonable, Dorothea. He might have moved against the property months ago. He chose not to, and why is he here now?" Her father was quiet, and that quiet told her more than his words had. "Father," she said, "he has a proposal." He said it quickly, as people say things they have rehearsed. "It is not. You are not obligated." He was very clear about that. "You are not obligated. But he asked to come and speak with you himself, and I thought you deserved to hear it from him rather than through lawyers." She sat with this for a long moment. The fire had burned low. Outside, the wind moved through the oak trees in the south lawn, and she could hear it through the old windows, which had never sealed quite properly since the glazier they'd used 20 years ago had done a less than thorough job. "What is the proposal?" she asked. Her father finally looked at her. His expression was the expression of a man who has done something he is not sure he can be forgiven for, but who has also run out of other choices. "Marriage," he said. She did not speak to Lord Calder that night. She excused herself on the grounds of a headache, which was not entirely untrue. There was a pressure behind her eyes that had been building since dinner, and she went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and thought, with great care and no particular emotion, about what her father had told her. The practical part of it was this. Thornwall would be lost without the mortgage, and there was no other way to address the mortgage. She had known this in some peripheral and unexamined way for some time. What she had not allowed herself to know was that they had already reached the point of consequence. The personal part of it, the part that was harder to examine, was this. She had not, when she pictured her future, ever pictured it as something that would be decided in a drawing room in a house she was failing to maintain, offered to a man she had met whiles ago over a roast that Mrs. Peel had done her best with, but which had still been rather oversalted. She was 27 years old. She was 27 years old. She had managed Thornwall alone for 3 years, since her mother died. And she had done it well, and she had been proud of that. In the private way, one is proud of things one does not speak about. She had kept the accounts. She had negotiated with tradesmen. She had made decisions about firewood and linen and staff with the same focused attention she brought to everything. She had believed, without ever stating it to herself plainly, that she was equal to whatever came. She was still equal to whatever came. She had not changed. But she sat in the dark for rather a long time before she got up and went to the window and looked out at the south lawn, where the oak trees were still moving, slow and steady in the wind. In the morning, she went to find Lord Calder before breakfast. He was in the garden. She had not expected that. She had expected him to be in the library, perhaps, or still in his room, or in the breakfast room with a newspaper. She had not expected to find him standing at the edge of the old kitchen garden, with his coat on against the cold, looking at the espaliered apple trees along the far wall, with the same attentive, unhurried focus she had seen in him the night before. He heard her coming on the gravel path and turned. "Miss Seville," he said. "Lord Calder." She stopped a few feet away. The morning was grey, and still the kind of November morning that looks like pewter, and her breath made small clouds in the air. I would like to speak with you." "Yes," he said. "I imagined you would." There was nothing dismissive in it. It was simply an acknowledgement, calm and direct, and she found, somewhat against her will, that she appreciated it. "My father told me last evening," she said, "about the mortgage and about your suggestion." "Proposal," he said, and there was something in the correction that was not unkindness but rather precision. "I would prefer not to call it a suggestion. It was a proposal, and I made it seriously, and I would prefer to discuss it in those terms if you are willing." She looked at him. He looked back. The apple trees stood bare and silver-brown behind him, the branches trained in careful fans against the old stone wall, the work of some gardener 40 years ago who had been thorough and patient and very skilled. "Then speak to me seriously," she said. He did. He told her with the same unhurried directness he seemed to bring to everything, that he had inherited the mortgage from his uncle's estate, along with several other surroundings and investment. He had spent the past 18 months rationalizing. He had not sought it. He was not in the habit of acquiring country properties through default. And he had no interest in beginning. He had looked at the accounts. She should know that he had looked at the accounts and found them, despite everything, better managed than many he had seen from houses twice the size of Thornwall with twice the staff. "You have been careful," he said. It was not a compliment in the ornamental sense. It was an observation. "I have tried to be," she said. He told her that he was 41 years old. He told her that he had a house in Wiltshire, a property in Scotland that he rarely visited, and a flat in London that he found useful, but not comfortable. He told her that he had been married once briefly, and that his wife had died of fever 6 years ago, and that he said this not as a bid for sympathy, but because he thought she deserved to know the factual circumstances of the person she was being asked to consider. He told her that he was not asking her to love him, and that he was not prepared to pretend that love was the nature of the proposition. He was asking her whether she might find it tolerable to share her life with someone who respected what she had done here, who had no intention of removing her from it, and who could offer her, in material terms, considerably more stability than she currently possessed. "And Thornwall," she said. "The mortgage would be discharged," he said. "The property would be settled in full to you, not to me, not held in trust. To you, in your own name, to manage as you see fit." She was quiet for a moment. The cold had got into her fingers through her gloves, and she was aware of it in a distant way, the way one is aware of small physical discomforts during large emotional events. "You are not what I expected," she said, because it was true, and she saw no reason not to say it. Something moved in his expression, brief and not entirely readable. "No," he said. "People rarely find that I am." They walked back toward the house together, slowly, not speaking much, and Dorothea looked at the garden she knew so well, the bare beds, the overgrown topiary that she had been slowly reclaiming, hedge by hedge, over the past 2 years, the stone wall along the south side where the roses would bloom in June, in the colors her mother had chosen. And she thought about all of it with the same careful, practical attention she always brought to her thinking. She did not give him an answer that morning. She told him she needed a week, and he said that was entirely reasonable, and they went in to breakfast. The week was strange. Lord Calder, she could not yet think of him as anything other than Lord Calder, remained at Thornwall for 3 more days at her father's invitation, and in those 3 days she came to know him, in the specific, surface way one knows someone from proximity and careful observation. He rose early. He walked the grounds every morning, regardless of weather. He read in the evenings and did not require conversation. He was courteous to Mrs. Peel and to the 2 remaining members of their staff in the way that people are courteous when they have been raised to consider it a basic obligation and not a performance. He did not follow her around the house. He did not seek her out for unnecessary conversation. He asked her, on the second afternoon, whether he might look at the far field, the one that had been leased to a neighbouring farmer for 3 years, and which she was considering whether to take back into direct use. And she said yes, and they walked out to look at it together, and he asked sensible questions and listened carefully to her answers, and when he had a thought of his own, he offered it as a thought rather than an instruction. On the third evening, they sat in the library after dinner while her father dozed in his chair across the room, and she asked him something she had been thinking about for 2 days. "Why here?" she said. "You could have offered this to anyone. You did not need to offer it at all. Why come to Thornwall and make a proposal to a woman you had never met when you could simply have taken the property through the courts?" He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he was deciding how honest to be. "Because I looked at what you had done here," he said at last, "and I thought that a person who had managed this, with this little, for this long, with this much care, was not someone to be turned out of her own home through a procedural mechanism. It seemed wrong." "That is not a business reason," she said. "No," he agreed. "It is not." She looked at him in the firelight. He looked back, steady and patient, and she thought, not for the first time in those 3 days, that there was something in his manner that was deeply familiar, not because she had met him before, but because she recognized the shape of it. He was a person who did not waste. He did not waste words or time or sentiment, and he did not waste the attention he paid to things. He looked at what was real and dealt with it as it was. She had spent 3 years doing the same. After he left, on the 4th morning, his carriage waiting in the drive while frost still lay in the shadows on the grass. She stood in the library for a long time. The room smelled of old paper and the remnants of last night's fire. Outside, the rooks were making noise in the elms at the edge of the property, the way they did every November morning, reliably, without fail. She thought about what he had said. She thought about Thornwall, and about the east garden, and about the rose wall in summer, and about the 3rd stair that creaked, and the drawing-room curtains that never hung quite straight. She thought about what it would mean to lose all of it, not through her own failure, but through a kind of accumulated misfortune that had begun long before she was old enough to have any say in it. And then she sat down at the desk and wrote him a letter. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, plainly, without ornament, saying what she meant. She told him she had thought carefully about his proposal and that she was prepared to accept it, on the conditions they had discussed. She told him that she was not a person who made decisions carelessly, and that she intended, having made this one, to honor it fully. She told him one other thing, which she had not planned to tell him, but which she found herself writing anyway, at the end, that she was glad he had come himself, and she was glad they had talked. She sent the letter with the morning post and went out to the garden. They were married in December, in the small church in the village that had been seeing Sevilles married and buried for 140 years. It was not a grand occasion. Her father was there, and a cousin she had not seen in some years who came from Edinburgh and brought good wine, and Lord Calder, William. She had begun to think of him, though she had not yet said it aloud, had a friend from his years at Cambridge who served as a witness, and who turned out to be a quietly amusing man, with an extensive knowledge of Scottish geology and very little interest in small talk, which Dorothea found immediately restful. She wore her mother's brooch on a dark green dress, and she stood next to William Calder before the vicar, and said what she had come to say, and when she looked at him during the ceremony he was already looking at her with the same steady, focused attention she had come to understand, was simply how he looked at things he considered worth looking at. After, They walked back through the village in the early afternoon light, and her cousin said something that made the Cambridge friend laugh. And her father looked better than he had in months, and the cold was the clean kind that smells of approaching winter and bare fields. William walked beside her. After a moment, without ceremony, he offered her his arm. She took it. The first months were quiet. She had expected difficulty, or not difficulty, precisely, but the friction of adjustment, the small negotiations of sharing a space and a life with someone who had been a stranger 4 months ago. There was some of that. He had habits she had to learn. She had habits that surprised him, she thought, though he was not the kind of man who showed surprise openly. He returned to London for stretches of 2 or 3 weeks at a time. For business reasons, he explained to her plainly and without condescension. And during those stretches, she ran Thornwall with the same attention she always had, except that, now, the accounts balanced without requiring any particular ingenuity. And she had been able to bring back 2 of the staff, and in February she rehired the gardener, who had been with them for 12 years before they'd had to let him go. Old Ferris shook her hand when he came back, which was not a thing he had ever done before, and then looked embarrassed about it and went away to assess the state of the kitchen garden, and Dorothea stood in the drive and watched him go and felt something ease in her chest that she had not fully known was tight. When William returned from London in March, she took him to see the East Garden, which had been her project for 2 years, and which Ferris's return had already improved considerably. The beds were dug and turned. The old stone edging had been reset where it had shifted. There was a smell of cold earth and the beginning of things. He stood at the edge of the main bed and looked at it for a while without speaking. "It's going to be good," he said. "I know," she said. He glanced at her, then a sideways look, and she saw something in it that she had not quite seen before, something that was not simply attention, but something warmer than that, something that was paying attention specifically to her, to the tone in her voice, and the way she was standing, and whatever it was in her face that she was not trying to hide. She did not look away. "Dorothea," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the miss attached, and the shift was small and enormous at the same time. "William," she said back, equally quiet. They walked back toward the house together in the early March light, and the rooks were doing their usual thing in the elms, and the front door of Thornwall stood open against the pale sky, the way it did on the first days, that were warm enough to leave it that way. It was in spring that Lady Harewood arrived. She came in a carriage that cost more than Dorothea had spent on Thornwall in a calendar year, attended by a maid and a small dog of highly opinionated temperament. And she presented herself at the door with the air of someone who had never in her life found a door closed to her. She was perhaps 35, and beautiful in the kind of way that is clearly aware of itself, and she had known William. "Lord Calder," she said, with a slight emphasis on the title, "for many years. We were very close," she said to Dorothea, in the drawing room over tea, with a smile that was calibrated to include just enough warmth to be plausibly friendly. "Before he went abroad." "How lovely," Dorothea said. She poured the tea with a steady hand and offered the better biscuits, and listened to Lady Harewood talk about London and the season and mutual acquaintances. She and Dorothea did not share, and she thought, with the same practical attention she brought to everything, about what she was looking at. What she was looking at was not a person who had simply come to call. She did not say anything about it to William that evening because she wanted to think about it first. She was not given to reactions before she had considered what was actually in front of her. But she was aware of a thing that was new, a thing she had not fully accounted for when she had made her very practical, very deliberate decision in December. something she had not permitted herself to identify, because identifying it would have made her vulnerable in a way she had decided, long ago, not to be. She sat up in the library after William had gone to bed and looked at the fire going low and allowed herself, for the first time, to be honest about it. She had come to care for him. It had happened slowly, in the margins of ordinary days, built from small things, the way he read, turning pages without sound. The questions he asked about the garden that were actually about her, the evening in February when the pipes, in the east corridor, had frozen, and they had spent 3 hours dealing with it together, and he had been, throughout, calm and practically useful, and once briefly funny about it, in a dry way that had made her laugh out loud in the cold corridor, with her sleeves pushed up and water on the flagstones, the way he said her name since March, Dorothea, without the careful social distance in it. Just her name, said plainly, which was the thing that had unmade her most of all. She had not expected to care for him. She had expected to respect him, and to manage, and to be content. She had not expected this. The fire died. She went to bed. Lady Harewood stayed 3 days, and on the second day, she managed to be alone with William for nearly an hour, which Dorothea observed from the upper hallway window, with a composed expression and a very firm grip on the window ledge. On the third day, she watched them walk together in the south lawn, Lady Harewood in her expensive coat, her dog racing ahead through the long grass at the edge of the garden. And she looked at Williamson's face from a distance, and tried to read it the way she read accounts, looking for the truth in what the numbers actually said, as opposed to what they were supposed to say. She could not read it. That was the honest answer. It was later, in the library, that she found out what had been said. She had not been listening. She had simply come to return a book, and the door had been ajar, and she heard Lady Harewood's voice before she registered that she should not be hearing it. Thought you might have come to London by now. Lady rather expected it. A pause. Thornwall requires some attention, William said. Does it? Another pause, and then something in Lady Harewood's voice shifted, became something lower and more deliberate. William, surely you do not mean to remain here indefinitely, whatever the circumstances of the arrangement. The circumstances of the arrangement, he said, and there was something in his voice that Dorothea had not heard in it before, something that had an edge in it, are not, I think, your concern. I only mean, I know what you mean. A longer silence. I am going to be plain with you, since we have known each other long enough for that. What you are suggesting is not a thing I intend to do. Dorothea is my wife. This is my home. I am not looking for an alternative to either, and I would prefer, going forward, not to have to say this a second time. Dorothea stood in the corridor with her book in her hands and her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do. She went back the way she had come and did not return the book until after Lady Harewood had left the following morning. He found her in the garden that afternoon. She was working on the rose wall, the south-facing one, her mother's roses, which were beginning to show the very first tentative green of new growth at the joints, and she heard him come down the path and turned, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. She has gone, he said. I know. She looked back at the wall. I heard the carriage. He came to stand beside her and looked at the roses. After a moment, you have been quiet today. I am often quiet, differently quiet, he said. She turned to look at him then, squarely the way she looked at things she intended to understand. He was looking back at her with that particular focused attention of his, and his expression was doing something she had catalogued before, but had not yet let herself interpret too specifically. I heard some of your conversation with Lady Harewood, she said. Inadvertently, I should tell you that. He absorbed this. How much? Enough. He was quiet for a moment, then, carefully, and? She looked at the roses for a long moment, at the new green coming through, at all the patient work of winter becoming visible in the furred tentative evidence of spring. "I did not expect to be glad of what I heard," she said. "I had not allowed myself to want. I did not think it would be fair to want anything beyond what we had agreed." "Dorothea." His voice was very quiet. "I am telling you," she said, still looking at the roses, "that I have come to care for you. I am not sure when it happened. I am telling you plainly because that is how I do things, and because I thought you should know, and because it seemed dishonest not to say it." She paused. "You do not have to. I am not asking anything in return. I simply wanted you to know." She made herself look at him then. He was looking at her, and his expression had come undone from its usual composure in a way that she had not seen before. And there was something in it that was very clear. "Dorothea," he said again, and then, after a moment, with a kind of careful precision that she recognized as how he said the things that mattered most to him, "I think you should know that I have been glad to come home every time I have come home since December. I think you should know that I find it considerably more difficult to leave than I expected it to be. And I think you should know that when I said what I said to Catherine Harewood this morning, I said it because it was true. Not because it was polite, and not because it was expected, but because it was simply true." The garden was very still. Above them, a pair of rooks crossed the pale sky. Slow and unhurried, she thought about the letter she had written in November, sitting at her father's desk, saying what she meant, plainly, the way she always did. She thought about the third stair that creaked, and the drawing-room curtains that never quite hung straight, and all the known imperfect, particular things that made up a place that was home. She thought about how she had not expected any of this. Not the proposal, not the careful, unexpected decency of the man who had made it, not this, not the way spring could come in through everything and make even the oldest things begin again. She reached out and took his hand. He looked down at it, and then at her, and she saw in his face what had been there for some time without her letting herself see it, what had perhaps been there even longer than she knew. "Then we are in agreement," she said. His hand closed around hers, steady and certain, the way he did everything. Behind them, the roses were very quietly beginning.